Chapter 3 The Resigned Self. From Resignation to Exaltation. If John Wesley had hopes of working out his own salvation in Georgia, he was soon to find himself frustrated on every front. The fantasy which had led him to undertake the mission soon became a nightmare. At the beginning, however, there was little warning of the oncoming debacle. On February 5th, 1736, Wesley's ship arrived in Savannah Harbor. Since his predecessor had not yet left Savannah, Wesley and his companions lodged for a few weeks on board the Simmons, and later with the Moravian community. He found the opportunity to continue his associations with the Moravians, begun on shipboard, quite stimulating, and was enthusiastic about the promise of an ongoing dialogue with the community and its leaders. As quickly as possible, however, he began to settle into the routine of duties required of him as chaplain to the colony, and to investigate the requirements of an effective ministry to the Indians. In his first encounters with the Indians, Wesley was sobered by the dimensions of the task, but not discouraged by it. When he viewed the mission to the heathen, along with his pastoral responsibilities to the settlement, he began to think of transplanting the Holy Club to Georgia in order to provide an adequate staff for the work at hand. Soon, however, the very conflicts which the Georgia experiment was to have put to rest began to manifest themselves again almost simultaneously. We have discussed at some length above the rejection by Wesley of any role which smacked of the ordinary, and we have characterized his basic understanding of the Georgia excursion as one of an extraordinary mission to the Indians. Oglethorpe, on the other hand, had conceived Wesley's role quite differently. The general's main interests were that his colony not only survive, but thrive. In his view, this success necessitated an active pastoral and priestly ministry by his clergymen, which would serve as an integrating force among the residents of the colony. Any mission to the natives would have to take a very secondary place in the hierarchy of priorities. As the press of the duties as chaplain to the colony began to mount, Wesley did not reject the claims made upon him by Oglethorpe. For a while, he attempted to fulfill both his pastoral and missionary responsibilities. As he learned more about the native morals, and more his earlier images of the noble savage seemed increasingly ridiculous, and he began to be discouraged with the prospects of his work among the Indians. While he did not give up his hopes of a ministry to the natives, his routine, as recorded in the journal, began to focus on his pastoral responsibility to the settlers at Savannah and Frederica. Though he had manifested a Methodist strictness in his early pastoral work in the colony, the increasing anger in his parishioners at his heavy-handedness in application of his ecclesiastical discipline seems to indicate that he was now performing his role with a vengeance. Given our perspectives on his goals in assuming the Georgia appointment, it seems appropriate for us to reflect upon what meaning this increasing strictness in his pastoral work had for John Wesley. Certainly Wesley believed himself simply to be doing his duty, but we know that the nature of this duty, the parish ministry, was that which he believed he had rejected in choosing the Georgia assignment. Now we see him assuming the role his father had wanted him to choose, but for all practical purposes under the coercion of Oglethorpe, and the realities of the situation with regard to the natives. If Wesley found himself coerced into a role not really of his choosing, why then did he not rebel and reject the ministry to the settlers? Wesley seemed instead to be actually embracing the style of ministry which his father pursued at Epworth, both as to the role and the manner of enacting it. We must remember, however, that Wesley considered his father to be a failure, and that he believed insensitivity and overly strict discipline to be among his father's cardinal weaknesses. From this perspective, then, Wesley can be said to be manifesting quite a subtle rebellion, one in a passive-aggressive mode. His eventual miserable failure as a parish minister to the colony can be seen as a defiant proclamation in itself, and a rough translation might read, "See, I told you I was not cut out for this ordinary role of a parish priest." We can best document this ministry with a vengeance and its consequences by relating the developments which led up to Wesley's humiliated flight from Georgia. These events offer us in a striking way a microcosm of the significance of the Georgia experiment. In them we see manifest the struggles with both maternal and paternal authority. Temptation, the Sophie Hopkey affair. If John Wesley had fantasies about being freed of sexual temptations in Georgia, he was soon to be shocked back into reality. In a note written to his brother in Frederica, John included a cryptic message in code. Quote, "I stand in jeopardy every hour. 2 or 3 women are here, young, pretty, God-fearing. Pray for me, that I know none of them after the flesh." Unquote. On March 13th, 1736, Wesley had met Sophia Christiana Hopkey at the home of her uncle, Thomas Coston, the director of supplies and chief magistrate of Savannah. We have already noted above that the conflict between sexual passion and religious commitment engendered by his mother led Wesley to take his libidinally loaded relationships with women and force himself to think of them as spiritual relationships only. As long as women were mothers, sisters, or counselees, it seemed all right for him to be in intimate relationship with them. Wesley's women, however, seemed to be able to read between the lines, and the mixed signals which they received often led them to expect more on the earthly side from John. When nothing more was forthcoming, the typical outcome was for the ladies to become impatient and to seek other relationships. Therefore, although the decision against further psychosexual intimacy is in effect made for him by the female involved, he in reality, because of the reign of maternal authority, rejected further sexual involvements through his decisive indecision. The Sophie affair manifests this pattern in all of its elements. From the very first, John was impressed with the purity and spiritual promise of the young woman and took every opportunity to tutor her in the basics of the spiritual life. She was a regular visitor at the rectory and was the most attentive of students. Though she had been engaged to one of the outlaws of the colony, Thomas Mellencamp, and had thereby scandalized her magistrate uncle, she now seemed bent on nothing more than the salvation of her soul and the imitation of Christ. In his journal, Wesley expressed his admiration for the young woman. Quote, "She was 18 years old, and from the beginning of our intimate acquaintance till this day, I verily believe she used no guile, not only because even now I know no instance to the contrary, nor only because the simplicity of her behavior was a constant voucher for her sincerity, but because of the entire openness of all her conversation, answering whatever questions I proposed, without either hesitation or reserve, immediately and directly." Unquote. She was humble and put on no pretense of sophistication. She seemed very patient and satisfied even in the absence of the niceties of life which the primitive conditions in Georgia made necessary. Her simplicity of taste extended to her dress. Quote, little of a gentlewoman in delicacy and niceness, she was still less so, if possible, in love of dress. No philosopher would have despised her love of adornment. Though always neat, she was always plain, and she was equally careless of finery in other things. It was use she considered, not show, nor novelty either, being as little concerned for new as for fine or pretty things. Unquote. Not only that, but she showed little interest in the typical diversions of young ladies of her age, such as balls or dancing. But her simplicity of taste did not mean that she manifested a dullness of mind or personality. Quote, her constant, even seriousness, was very far from stupidity. Indeed, her understanding was not of a piece with her years. Though unimproved, it was deep and strong. It reached the highest things and the lowest. It rose to the greatest, yet stooped to the least. With fine sense she had a large share of common sense, and particularly of prudence, suiting herself readily to all persons and occasions, nature in her supplying the place of experience. Her apprehension was so quick that there was scarce ever need to repeat a thing twice to her, and so clear as to conceive things the most remote from common life without any mistake or confusion. Unquote. After continuing to wax eloquent regarding the virtues he could discern in the attractive young lady, he added a few lines which serve as a summary of her spiritual condition. Quote, the temper of her heart towards God is best known by him who seeth in secret. What appeared of it was a deep, even reverence ripening into love, and a resignation unshaken in one of the severest trials which human nature is exposed to. The utmost anguish never wrung from her a murmuring word. The utmost anguish never wrung from her a murmuring word. She saw the hand of God, and was still. She said, indeed, if it be possible, Father, but added, not as I will, but as thou wilt. Unquote. Whether Miss Sophie in fact manifested the strong faith and resignation Wesley perceived in her, or whether he was projecting upon her an emotional and spiritual state which he himself was avidly seeking, cannot be ascertained. The comments here are nevertheless quite revealing. The resignation which Wesley believed that he discerned and clearly admired was a resignation in the face of a troublesome love affair. The gravity with which Wesley assessed such a condition is evident in his characterization of it as one of the severest trials which human nature is exposed to. That Wesley was beginning to perceive himself to be a fellow sufferer in this condition, if not sharing the resignation, is evident in the following statement, which closed his account of Sophie's character. Quote, such was the woman, according to my close observation, of whom I now began to be much afraid. My desire and design was still to live single, but how long it would continue I knew not. I therefore consulted my friends whether it was not best to break off all intercourse with her immediately. They expressed themselves so ambiguously that I understood them to mean that I ought not to break it off, and accordingly she came to me, as had been agreed, every morning and evening." Unquote. The threat to his own resolution to live single had been building for some time. He had been particularly interested in this pupil since the inception of their relationship. He had undoubtedly felt that one of his appropriate tasks as her spiritual director was to help her bring her involvement with and investment in the petty criminal Mellencamp to an end. He had tried to turn her mind to spiritual things and believed that he was making some progress toward that end. Her uncle, believing that a stay away from Savannah would help her to forget Mellencamp, had sent her away to Frederica. John was troubled that he could no longer minister to her as carefully as previously, and his fears concerning her spiritual and emotional state proved to be well founded. After a short time in Frederica, Sophie's depression became much more pronounced, and the concerned Coston asked Wesley to do what he could to help her. Coston's plea had undertones which suggest that he believed Wesley could be helpful in a way that the young clergyman would find very problematic. Quote, "Some of his words were as follows: 'The girl will never be easy till she is married.' I answered, 'Sir, she is too much afflicted to have a thought of it.' He replied, 'I'll trust a woman for that. There is no other way.' I said, 'But there are few here who you would think fit for her.' He answered, 'Let him be but an honest man, an honest good man. I don't care whether he has a groat. I can give them a maintenance.' I asked, 'Sir, what directions do you give me with regard to her?' He said, 'I give her up to you. Do what you will with her. Take her into your own hands. Promise her what you will. I will make it good." Unquote. If Wesley had been concerned about Sophie's condition when he left Savannah, on arriving in Frederica he found it even worse than he had feared. She had decided that there was no reason for her stay in Georgia, and she had now resolved to return to England at the first opportunity. His immediate response to this proposal was that such an action would complete her destruction. This response on his part is an indication of his increasing investment in the young woman. On the face of it, Sophie's return to England would remove a major source of temptation which he perceived to be a threat to his mission in the colony. But instead of supporting her resolve to leave Georgia, he brought every religious argument which he could muster into play against this new design of hers. For more than a week he sought to persuade her that her soul would be greatly endangered if she left the colony, and more particularly his spiritual tutelage. Her lack of response to his arguments forced him to change his approach. Quote, "In the evening I asked Miss Sophie if she was still determined to go to England. On her answering yes, I offered several arguments drawn from the topics of religion against it, but they did not appear to make any impression. Then I pressed her upon the head of friendship, upon which she burst into tears, and said, 'Now my resolution begins to stagger,' as it did more and more every day." Unquote. It was, however, an unpleasant encounter which Wesley had with General Oglethorpe, which led to her decision to remain in the colony. The exploits of the Wesley brothers had increasingly come to be viewed by Oglethorpe as a divisive force in the colony. He had been surprised and disappointed at Charles Wesley's seemingly incompetent and irresponsible behavior, and after several conflicts which were embarrassing to both of them, the younger brother had found an excuse to return to England. Now, it seemed, John's own somewhat problematic relationship with the general was deteriorating. Oglethorpe had just returned to the colony from a diplomatic mission, and John now found him more cold and withdrawn than before. Disconcerted by this negative turn in his relationship to the general and believing his own position in the colony to be threatened, he shared his fears with Sophie. Quote, "When I mentioned it to Miss Sophie, I added, 'Now, Miss Sophie, you may go to England, for I can assist you no longer. My interest is gone.' She answered, 'No, now I will not stir a foot. If Mr. Oglethorpe,' I said, 'advised you to go, he may be displeased.' She replied, 'Let him be pleased or displeased, I care not.' And then, turning to me with the utmost earnestness, she said, 'Sir, you encouraged me in my greatest trials. Be not discouraged in your own. Fear nothing. If Mr. Oglethorpe will not, God will help you.'" Unquote. Sophie had now decided to remain in the colony, and it was soon decided that for her own good she would return to Savannah. Wesley's growing emotional investment in this relationship was to come to a head during the subsequent boat trip. It had been decided that John and Sophie were to share passage on one of the small boats during the difficult journey of several days. The conditions thrust them together in a situation which enabled them to talk incessantly and to renew their spiritual discussions in a context of physical hardship. That Wesley had been aware of the temptation involved before leaving Frederica is evident in the following journal entry. Quote, "I asked Mr. Oglethorpe in what boat she should go. He said, 'She can go in none but yours, and indeed there is none so proper.' I saw the danger to myself, but yet had a good hope I should be delivered out of it, because it was not my choice which brought me into it, because I still felt in myself the same desire and design to live a single life, and because I was persuaded, should my desire and design be changed, yet her resolution to live single would continue." Unquote. This was the first mention in the journal of Sophie's intention not to marry. Evidently, in an earlier discussion of the Mellencamp relationship, she had told him of her decision, and, since his involvement with her had not yet developed to this alarming degree, he had failed to enter the comment. Now, however, her resolve had taken on a new importance, since his was beginning to weaken. The trip was even more difficult than usual, and a violent storm forced them to camp on St. Catherine's Island and wait for suitable weather and winds. Sophie's courage and patience during a journey under such adverse conditions, combined with her openness to religious instruction, seemed to have warmed his heart and softened his resolution. The close proximity to her in the boat was one thing, but the intimacy of soft conversation with her at night by campfire was quite another. John Wesley's resolution was indeed endangered. Quote, "Observing in the night the fire we lay by burning bright, that Miss Sophie was broad awake, I asked her, 'Miss Sophie, how far are you engaged to Mr. Mellencamp?' She answered, 'I have promised him either to marry him or to marry no one at all.' I said, which indeed was the expression of a sudden wish, not of any formed design, 'Miss Sophie, I should think myself happy if I was to spend my life with you.' She burst out into tears and said, 'I am every way unhappy. I won't have Tommy, for he is a bad man, and I can have none else.' She added, 'Sir, you don't know the danger you are in. I beg you would speak no more on this head.' And after a while, 'When others have spoken to me on the subject, I felt an aversion to them, but I don't feel any to you. We may converse on other subjects as freely as ever. Both my judgment and will acquiesced in what she said, and we ended our conversation with a psalm." Unquote. John had said what he meant rather than what he meant to say. Given his fantasies of resolution to live single, he must have been shaken by what he heard himself saying. Neither was her weak rejoinder to settle the matter for either of them. She continued to protest her unwillingness to live with her uncle, and Wesley proposed, among other alternatives, that she could move into one of the rooms of his house. Though she did not accept this very generous offer on his part, on arriving in Savannah, he arranged the next best alternative. She would lodge with her uncle and would spend most of her time with John at his residence. Quote, "The time she was at my house was spent thus. Immediately after breakfast, we all joined in Hick's devotions. She was then alone till 8. I taught her French between 8 and 9, and at 9 we joined in prayer again. She then read or wrote French till 10. In the evening I read to her, and some others select parts of Ephraim Cyrus, and afterwards Dean Young's and Mr. Reeves' sermons. We always concluded with a psalm." Unquote. Wesley was not altogether unaware of the temptation involved in the new arrangement with Miss Sophie. In a reference to the schedule noted above, he concluded, quote, "This I began with a single eye, but it was not long before I found it a task too hard for me to preserve the same intention with which I began, in such intimacy of conversation as ours was." Unquote. It was indeed the question of intimacy which was central in Wesley's ambivalence with regard to Sophie. Earlier in his life, he had learned to bridle his desire for psychosexual intimacy by staging an opposition between such a desire and his commitment to hard work in matters relating to his religious vocation. This occasion was to be no exception. He began to entertain seriously again the mission to the Indians. He raised the matter again with Oglethorpe, who was in Savannah preparing for another trip to England. The general's response was brief and to the point. "You cannot leave Savannah without a minister." John's response to Oglethorpe and his reflections on that response are of central importance to our analysis of the significance of the Georgia experience. The following journal entry reflects not only his growing frustrations at not having made progress on his extraordinary mission to the heathen, but also the use of evasion as a tactic to deal with the problem of psychosexual intimacy. Quote, "To this indeed my plain answer was, I know not that I am under any obligation to the contrary. I never promised to stay here 1 month. I openly declared both before, at, and ever since my coming hither, that I neither would nor could take charge of the English any longer than till I could go among the Indians. If it was said, 'But did not the trustees of Georgia appoint you to be the minister of Savannah?' I replied, 'They did, but it was not done by my solicitation. It was done without either my desire or knowledge. Therefore I cannot conceive that appointment to lay me under any obligation of continuing there any longer than till the door is opened to the heathen. And this I expressly declared at the time I consented to accept of that appointment." Unquote. Wesley was obviously feeling caught up in an ordinary role, which he believed he had escaped by undertaking the Georgia mission. His attempt, if our analysis is correct, to do penance for the transgression of paternal authority had been, up to now, sidetracked. But here again, we see the urge to go among the Indians manifesting itself as an attempt to obey the dictates of the internalized maternal authority. Quote, "But though I had no other obligation not to leave Savannah now, yet that of love I could not break through. I could not resist the importunate request of the more serious parishioners to watch over their souls yet a little longer till someone came who might supply my place." Unquote. He did not press the question of his ministry to the Indians at this point, primarily because he had managed to interweave his involvement with a love I could not break through with his duty as a spiritual guide to the residents of Savannah. Again, his old tactic of disguising his role as suitor with the trappings of that of a spiritual guide enabled him to maintain his quest for psychosexual intimacy without having to admit honestly to himself the degree of his interest in the fleshly and carnal aspect of life. His other old tactic, that of hard, obsessive work, was also pressed into service at this point. He threw himself into his almost ruthless work schedule. He compiled a French grammar for Sophie, continued his study of Spanish, continued his work on a German grammar, learned Byram's shorthand, transcribed hymns, and prepared them for publication, all while continuing his heavy load of pastoral duties. A new element entered the situation at this time in the person of William Williamson, a young man who was serving as Coston's clerk and who was boarding in the magistrate's residence. Sophie had invited him to attend the meeting of the society which was meeting in John's home. Wesley later apparently felt that he had been partially responsible for the beginning of her relationship with Williamson, and made a note of the irony of his own contribution to the beginning of the end of their relationship. Quote, "In the beginning of December I advised Miss Sophie to sup earlier, and not immediately before she went to bed. She did so, and on this little circumstance, for by this she began her intercourse with Mr. Williamson, what an inconceivable train of consequences depend, not only all the color of remaining life for her, but perhaps all my happiness too, in time and eternity." Unquote. But even his obsessive workload and his armor provided by his role as spiritual advisor did not alleviate his belief that his resolution was in a great deal of danger. To bolster his commitment to his resolution, he wrote down a list of his best intentions. December 19th, 1736. In the name of God, 1. To be more watchful before and in prayer. 2. To strive to be thankful in eating. 3. Not to touch even her clothes by choice. Think not of her. 4. Every hour have I prayed quite sincerely. Pray that you may watch, strive. 5. Look into no book but the Bible till Christmas. 6. From 12 to 4 o'clock, meditation or perish, no writing or reading. 7. At Miss Bovey's startup, the moment you end the paragraph. At Miss Bovey's, start up the moment you end the paragraph. No word afterward. 8. Speak no untended or unintended word. Wesley's methods, however, did not save him from the effect of his rapidly weakening resolution. Up to this point, he had managed to minimize the intensity of his own feelings and to deny the very real possibility that he was approaching the point of an irrevocable commitment in the relationship. Indeed, his capacity for denial had been, and continued to be, formidable. Nevertheless, the realities of his relationship with Sophie began to strain even his overdeveloped defense mechanisms to the breaking point. 3 weeks after the solemnly recorded resolutions noted above, he again began to feel the weakness of his position. Quote, I was now in a great strait. I still thought it best for me to live single, and this was still my design, but I felt the foundations of it shaken more and more every day, insomuch that I again hinted at a desire of marriage, though I made no direct proposal. For indeed it was only a sudden thought, which had not the consent of my own mind. Yet I firmly believe, had she, Miss Sophie, closed with me at that time, my judgment would have made but a faint resistance. Unquote. Sophie had coyly responded that she believed it was best for clergymen not to marry, and that she thought herself also resolved never to marry. Later in the relationship, Wesley began to reflect upon the possibility that some of her responses were designed to quicken him and induce him to declare himself more forthrightly. If he had any such insights at this time, however, there is no indication of it. Still, he was very concerned about this narrow escape, and sought out the pastor of the Moravians to ask his advice as to whether or not he should break off the relationship. Quote, he asked, what do you think would be the consequence if you should? I said, I fear her soul would be lost, being surrounded with dangers, and having no other person to warn her of and arm her against them. He added, and what do you think would be the consequence if you should not break it off? I said, I fear I should marry her. He replied short, I don't see why you should not. Unquote. Wesley was amazed. The Moravian obviously did not share his fear of and distaste for the institution of matrimony. He now began to question for the first time the necessity of remaining unmarried. When he told his friends and co-workers Ingham and Delamott of Pastor Tolschig's comments, they immediately took the opposite point of view, suggesting that her apparent sincerity and character were really a facade designed to interest him in marrying her. At any rate, they counseled him he should avoid seeing her for a while so that he could think the matter over with more detachment. He was never one to neglect an adviser recommending detachment, and he decided to go to the little settlement of Irene to ponder the question. Before leaving, he wrote Sophie a short note. Quote, I find, Miss Sophie, I can't take fire into my bosom, and not be burnt. I am therefore retiring for a while to desire the direction of God. Join with me, my friend, in fervent prayer, that he would show me what is best to be done. Unquote. After arriving in the little village, he began to weigh the pros and cons endemic to the relationship with Sophie. His spirits fluctuated between cheerfulness and depression, and he seemed to make little or no progress in his deliberations. The next morning it was necessary for him to make a trip back into Savannah to attend some pastoral responsibilities. There he found the proximity to Sophie without being able to see her almost unbearable. There I stayed about an hour, and there again I felt and groaned under the weight of an unholy desire. My heart was with Miss Sophie all the time. I longed to see her, were it but for a moment. And when I was called to take the boat, it was as the sentence of death. But believing it was the call of God, I obeyed. Unquote. If at this point Wesley had indulged his unholy desire to be with Sophie, the affair might well have turned out differently. The The Moravian had given him at least some support in his struggle against the prohibitions of the maternal authority, and he realized that to return to Irene at this critical juncture might mean the death not only of the relationship with Sophie, but also of a very precious, though neglected, part of himself. Resignation. Wesley had come to the end of his leash and was unable or unwilling to break it. Sophie had proved to be far more tempting than he had ever thought possible, and he had begun to entertain thoughts which he had previously believed unthinkable. The attitude of the Moravians had lent support to his own desire for psychosexual intimacy by denying that a conjugal relationship necessarily had to be harmful to one's religious vocation. Ingham and Delamont, however, jealously gave their support to his earlier resolve to remain celibate. His statement to Sophie that he could not take fire into his bosom and not be burned probably indicates that even before retiring to meditate on the issue, the outcome was little in doubt. If the passion he was feeling had become identified in his mind with the fires of the Epworth parsonage and of hell, then there was little doubt but that it was something to escape from. Before taking boat back to Irene, he experienced a fantasy or daydream which marks clearly the beginning of the end of their relationship and which offers an important insight into the resigned self of John Wesley. Quote, I walked a while to and fro on the edge of the water, heavy laden and pierced through with many sorrows. There one came to me and said, You are still in doubt what is best to be done. First, then, cry to God, that you may be wholly resigned, whatever shall appear to be His will. Whatever shall appear to be His will. I instantly cried to God for resignation, and I found that and peace together. I said, Sure, it is a dream. I was in a new world. The change was as from death to life. I went back to Irene, wondering and rejoicing, but withal exceedingly fearful lest my want of thankfulness for this blessing, or of care to improve it, might occasion its being taken away. Wesley's ambivalence with regard to this blessing of resignation merits some careful reflection. At one moment he is experiencing the call to return to Irene as a sentence of death, and shortly afterward he experiences his newfound resignation to be a change from death to life. On one level, to turn away from the promise of psychosexual intimacy with Sophie, he felt to be equivalent to writing a death warrant for an important part of his developing self. On another, much more familiar, level, the consummation of that relationship threatened an outbreak of the dangerous fires which his mother had taught him would consume his commitment to his special religious vocation. The fire which could be admitted into his bosom would have to be of a very special kind and certainly not overtly sexual in nature. Though not particularly thankful for this blessing of resignation, he had managed to dampen to a significant degree his ardor. Through it, he had managed to dampen to a significant degree his ardor for intensifying the relationship with Sophie. His battle with the internalized maternal authority had been lost, and his commitment to seek his religious vocation in a state of celibacy began to gain in strength. Quote, I was now more clear in my judgment every day. Beside that, I believed her resolve never to marry. I was convinced it was not expedient for me for two weighty reasons. One, because it would probably obstruct the design of my coming into America, the going among the Indians, and two, because I was not strong enough to bear the complicated temptations of a married state. Wesley obviously thought that he had settled the issue once and for all. On returning to Savannah, he informed Ingham de la Motte and his Moravian friends of his decision. That he was hesitant to face Sophie with the results of his sojourn in the wilderness is evident in the fact that he delayed 2 days after returning before he confronted her. Quote, about 7 in the morning I told her in my own garden, I am resolved, Miss Sophie, if I marry at all, not to do it until I have been among the Indians. Unquote. From Wesley's previous experiences with women, we can conclude that he fully intended to continue his relationship to her as a spiritual advisor. He had managed to handle intense and intimate relationships with others in this way, and he undoubtedly saw no reason why this should not be the case in this situation. Sophie, however, was not to be flanked so easily by his over-rationalized tactics, and began to make a few strategic moves on her own. Her response was a surprising one to him. She told him that others in the colony were wondering why she spent so much time at his house, that she would stop having breakfast with them, and that she would cease coming to the parsonage alone. Here we have a hint as to Sophie's attitude toward John at this time. One less blind to the intricacies of courtship rituals would no doubt interpret this move on Sophie's part as an attempt to shake John's resolve by denying him her company in lieu of a more acceptable commitment on his part. When no change of mind was forthcoming, the next morning she escalated her attack on his recalcitrance. Quote, she said, I don't think it signifies for me to learn French any longer. But she added, my uncle and aunt, as well as I, will be glad of your coming to our house as often as you please. I answered, you know, Miss Sophie, I don't love a crowd, and there is always one there. She said, but we needn't be in it. Unquote. She seems to have hoped that these warnings would be enough, for she continued to come to the parsonage for devotional meetings and prayer services. She even continued her French lessons, though at her uncle's house. In spite of her seemingly purposeful moves to force John into a proposal, she allowed their close association to continue, apparently still hoping that his resolve would weaken without further moves on her part. Her frustration, nevertheless, soon became evident. 3 days later, he noticed a distinct change in her behavior. Quote, I called upon her at Mr. Coston's, and we walked together in the garden. She did not seem to be affected with anything I said, but was in such a temper as I never saw her before, sharp, fretful, and disputatious. Yet in an hour she waked as out of a sleep, told me she had been very ill all day, and indeed scarce in her senses, and feared she had given a sufficient proof of it in her behavior, which she begged I would not impute to her, but solely to her disorder. Which she begged I would not impute to her, but solely to her disorder. Unquote. At this time a dispute had broken out between Coston and the Moravians as to whether the latter could be pressed into military service against their will. John took the side of the Moravians, and, thinking that he could use a trip to England to recruit additional help for his ministry in Georgia, decided that either he or Ingham should make a trip to London to consult with the trustees and other friends of their mission. Perhaps John now saw leaving Georgia as an escape from temptation. He raised the question with Sophie, and her intense response was puzzling to him. She had stated that if he left America, then she had no other ties to the colony. That evening he asked her what she had meant, and with tears she responded that he was the best friend she had ever had in the world. He tested the degree of her commitment to him by raising the specter of his losing his position in the colony. Would she then remain loyal to him? Her response left no question, as she declared that he would never want while she had anything. Such a protestation like that, protestation must have weakened his capacity for distancing himself from her. Such a protestation must have weakened his capacity for distancing himself from her, since in the following few days he felt himself to be acutely threatened in his resolve once again. Quote, calling at Mrs. Coston's Saturday, 26. She was there alone. This was indeed an hour of trial. Her words, her eyes, her air, her every motion and gesture were full of such a softness and sweetness. I know not what might have been the consequence had I then but touched her hand, and how I avoided it I know not. Surely God is over all. Unquote. At least his maternally inspired resignation was still intact in spite of the buffeting it was receiving at the hands of this tempting young lady. The next day he found himself alone again with Sophie, and this time he made the mistake of taking her by the hand. He felt himself utterly disarmed when she was not displeased by his action. Quote, I should have engaged myself for life had it not been for the full persuasion I had of her entire sincerity, and in consequence of which I doubted not but she was resolved, as she had said, never to marry while she lived. Unquote. Here again Wesley betrays either a lack of understanding or a lack of willingness to understand the meaning of behavior which seemed so clear to others. We see here a repeat of Wesley's tendency to force others to take responsibility for decisions that are rightfully his. If his behavior leads to a rejection by others, then the separation is their responsibility, not his. Still, he was aware that he had had a close call. He reaffirmed his resolution, made several months earlier, not to touch even her clothes by choice, and also resolved, with the help of God, to be more wary in the future. Delamont, however, was not aware of the degree of Wesley's aversion to marriage. He was extremely fearful that Wesley was about to marry Sophie, and in tears announced his decision to move out of the parsonage, since he could not remain after John's marriage. After consultation with both Ingham and Delamont, lots were cast to gain insight into God's will on the subject. On the 3 lots were written, Marry, think not of it this year, think of it no more. Delamont drew the 3rd. Lots were cast again to determine whether John should converse with Sophie any more. The answer came, only in the presence of Mr. Delamont. Wesley was surprised to find that he could say cheerfully, Thy will be done. Delamont had suggested that Wesley did not know his own heart with respect to Sophie. There is little doubt that he was still greatly tempted, and the positive aspects of a marriage to Sophie were clearly on his mind. Quote, I saw and adored the goodness of God, though what he required of me was a costly sacrifice. It was indeed the giving up at once whatever this world affords of agreeable, not only honor, fortune, power, which indeed were nothing to me, who despise them as the clay in the streets, but all the truly desirable conveniences of life: a pleasant house, a delightful garden on the brow of a hill at a small distance from the town, another house and garden in the town, and a third a few miles off, with a large tract of fruitful land adjoining to it." Unquote. For someone to whom such things were as the clay of the streets, the young man had certainly done a very thorough accounting of the things which would accrue to him through a marriage to Sophie. Yet the costliest part of the sacrifice was Sophie herself. Quote, "And above all, what to me made all these things else vile and utterly beneath a thought, such a companion as I never expected to find again, should I live 1,000 years twice told, so that I could not but cry out, O Lord God, thou God of my fathers, plenteous in mercy and truth, behold, I give thee, not thousands of rams, or 10,000s of rivers of oil, but the desire of my eyes, the joy of my heart, the one thing upon earth which I longed for. O give me wisdom, which sitteth by the throne, and reject me not from among thy children." Unquote. The increasing dominance of this temptation in the wilderness theme calls for some reflection on the changing role the Georgia experiment was coming to have in Wesley's experience. At the outset, the Georgia excursion had been seen as an escape from the temptations of the ordinary, the parish priesthood, and psychosexual intimacy, and certainly not as the locus of his severest test in this area. With the onslaught of Sophie, and the real possibility of becoming a prosperous but quite ordinary planter priest, the role of Georgia in his spiritual economy underwent a quite radical transformation. The script now called for dramatic suffering in the arena of sexuality, and for a self-righteously flamboyant failure, on principle of course, in the arena of his ordinary and altogether unsatisfactory role as a parish priest. The dramatic suffering was to begin first and to modulate at various levels of intensity throughout the rest of his life. The flamboyant failure was to terminate with this his last and unplanned engagement in an ordinary parish ministry. The flamboyant failure was to terminate with this his last and unplanned engagement in an ordinary parish ministry, and both manifested a submission before the maternal authority and a resignation to Susanna's early inculcated master plan for his life. A drama of temptation would not be too impressive if one found complete resignation too early, and John was not one to make this error. John reflected on the magnificence of God's intervention in bolstering his faltering will. Quote, "From the directions I received from God this day, touching an affair of the greatest importance, I could not but observe, as I had done many times before, the entire mistake of those who assert, God will not answer your prayer unless your heart be wholly resigned to his will. My heart was not wholly resigned to his will. Therefore, not daring to depend on my own judgment, I cried the more earnestly to him to supply what was wanting in me. And I know, and am assured, he heard my voice, and did send forth his light and his truth." Unquote. John found opportunities still abounded for temptation. He went riding with Caston over the latter's plantation, and found that the pleasantness of the experience shot a softness into his soul. Returning to the home of the magistrate, he found Sophie still very much the temptress, and the dark side of his soul still much too receptive. Soon after I came in, Miss Sophie went out, and walked to and fro between the door and the garden. I saw She wanted to speak to me, but remembered my resolutions, especially that to converse with her only in Mr. Delamont's presence. Yet, after a short struggle, the evil soul prevailed in me, and I went." Unquote. Apparently, Sophie had received a letter from her old lover, Mellencamp, and had refused to take it from the messenger. Though John had apparently already heard about this from Costan, Sophie's apparent purpose was to ask him not to question the messenger about the letter. A more likely conclusion is that Sophie wanted to emphasize to him that she had in fact refused the letter. Evidently, John had already begun to see William Williamson as a potential rival for Sophie's affections, since he used this opportunity to tell Sophie that Williamson had been the one who had informed her uncle of her receipt of the letter. He emphasized that he would not have been guilty of such a breach of confidence. In these shared moments of intimacy, he again felt the sweet threat. Quote, "I looked upon her, and should have said too much had we had a moment longer. But in the instant Mr. Coston called us in, so I was once more snatched as a brand out of the fire." Unquote. Wesley must have felt that God had great plans in store for this brand to be continually snatching it from the fire. Still, he showed a reluctance to see the situation resolved in such a way that would remove the flames to a more comfortable distance. He questioned Sophie at some length regarding her feelings for both Mellencamp and her new suitor, Williamson, and she assured him that she had no inclinations for either. Conveniently ignoring the deceptive quality of the message he was communicating to Sophie at this point, he extracted assurances from her that she would never deceive him, and that she would take no steps of importance without first consulting him. He had ensured the continuing presence of his conflict regarding what to do about the relationship with Sophie. Quote, "She went, and I saw myself in the toils, but how to escape I saw not. If I continued to converse with her, though not alone, I found I should love her more and more, and the time to break it off was past. I felt it was now beyond my strength. My resolutions indeed remained, but how long? Yet a little longer, till another shock of temptation, and then I well knew they would break in sunder as a thread of tow that has touched the fire." I had many times prayed that if it was best our intercourse should break off, and that if I could not do it, she might, but this too I saw less and less reason to expect, so that all these things were against me, and I lay struggling in the net, nay, scarcely struggling, as even fearing to be delivered." Unquote. That night another letter from Mellencamp to Sophie was intercepted by her aunt, and Sophie came under an angry attack by the Costans. Sophie pleaded with John to intercede for her, and he found the aunt enraged, threatening to throw Sophie out of the household, and asking John to take her away with him. There's little doubt that this solution would have satisfied Sophie, but John offered only his lodgings in his house, and any of his belongings, but no proposal of marriage. He left Sophie while she was still weeping over her situation, and found himself extremely depressed. It had become far too costly for Sophie to continue playing the role of temptress with no resolution of the situation in sight. Williamson had none of John's conflicts and reticence, and, seeing his opportunity, proposed to her that evening. From her point of view, it must have seemed that Wesley had had his opportunity to rescue her from her distress, and, when no move on his part was forthcoming, she had to accept the only alternative that the situation offered. If, as John later suspected, there was artifice on her part, and she hoped to force an intervention from him, there is little doubt that she was resolved to get out of the Coston household one way or another. The next morning, Wesley received the news of Sophie's betrothal from Mrs. Coston. She told him first that they were all appreciative of the many things he had done for Sophie, and then announced in quick succession that Williamson had proposed to their niece the night before, that he had asked for their consent and had received it. His shock must have been obvious. Quote, she added, "Sir, you don't seem to be well pleased. Have you any objection to it?" I answered, "Madame, I don't seem to be awake. Surely I am in a dream." She said, "They agreed on it last night between themselves after you was gone, and afterwards Mr. Williamson asked Mr. Coston's and my consent, which we gave them. But if you have any objection to it, pray speak. Speak to her. She is at the lot. Go to her." Unquote. She continued to press him and to suggest that he go to Sophie and talk to her about the decision. He resisted her at this point, since he had long known of the Costons' interest in him as a potential match for Sophie, and was now suspicious that he was being manipulated in some way. Quote, I doubted whether all this were not artifice, merely designed to quicken me. But though I was uneasy at the very thought of her marrying one who, I believed, would make her very unhappy, yet I could not resolve to save her from him by marrying her myself. Unquote. That Sophie had little chance to force an intervention on Wesley's part is evident by the reasoning which he employed at that time to justify avoiding any precipitate acts on his part. Quote, besides, I reasoned thus: either she is engaged or not. If she is, I would not have her if I might. If not, there is nothing in this show which ought to alter my preceding resolution. Unquote. In the following section of his account, Wesley pleads ignorance with regard to the real nature of what was going on. The question, however, arises as to whether his own feigned ignorance was not an artifice designed not to quicken him, but to support his resolution not to marry. Quote, thus was I saved purely by my ignorance, for though I did doubt, I would not believe. For though I did doubt, I would not believe. I thought it unkind and unjust to believe an artifice of which I had not full proof. Oh, let no one ever fear the being lost by thinking no evil. Had I known the snare, I had perished thereby. All the world could not have saved me. Had I then seen the real case to be this: she is engaged, but conditionally only. Mr. Williamson shall marry her, if you will not. I could not have stood that shock. I should have incurred any loss rather than she should have run that hazard of losing both her body and soul in hell. Unquote. That afternoon he did confront Sophie and Williamson. Williamson initiated the tedious conversation on the subject, after an initial exchange of pleasantries, by inquiring as to whether Wesley had heard the news. Wesley responded that he wanted to hear it from Sophie directly. Their interchange is significant. Quote, she replied, Sir, I have given Mr. Williamson my consent, unless you have anything to object. It started into my mind, what if she means, unless you will marry me? But I checked the thought with, Miss Sophie is so sincere. If she meant so, she would say so, and replied, if you have given your consent, the time is past. I have nothing to object. Unquote. Wesley was indeed getting the message, but was refusing to let himself hear it. His plans had no real place for marriage, and, despite the intense pain during and following this episode, Sophie was viewed not as a potential mate for life, but as a siren, playing the role of chief temptress in the American wilderness. That he was relieved at her taking the decision out of his hands is evident by the scriptural oracles which he then regarded as answers to his situation. One read, "Blessed be thou of the Lord, my daughter, for thou hast showed more kindness at the latter end than at the beginning." Sophie's decision was a relief. After their initial conversation, Williamson felt secure enough of his position to leave John and Sophie alone together. John describes his state of mind at this moment. Quote, "'Tis hard to describe the complication of passions and tumult of thought which I then felt. Fear of her approaching misery, and tender pity, grief for my own loss, love shooting through all the recesses of my soul, and sharpening every thought and passion. Underneath, there was a faint desire to do and suffer the will of God, which, joined to a doubt whether that proposal would be accepted, was just strong enough to prevent my saying plainly, what I wonder to this hour I did not say, 'Miss Sophie, will you marry me?'" Unquote. Wesley pressed her regarding her resolution not to marry a man who was not clearly religious. She replied that she had no proof that Williamson was not, but Wesley insisted that she should have been unsatisfied with anything less than a positive proof. Under a great strain, Sophie protested weakly that she had given her consent under the condition that he would not object to the union. John did not accept this clear plea and respond to it. Instead, they both spent the rest of their time alone in tears as about an hour passed. When Williamson returned, she told him that she hoped they could always be friends. His response indicated that as his ties to Sophie were severed, so also were those to America. His realization that the relationship was finally at an end cast him into a deep depression. Quote, "I came home and went into my garden. I walked up and down, seeking rest but finding none. From the beginning of my life to this hour I had not known one such as this. God let loose my inordinate affection upon me, and the poison thereof drank up my spirit. I was as stupid as if half awake, and yet in the sharpest pain I ever felt. To see her no more, that thought was as the piercings of a sword. It was not to be borne nor shaken off. I was weary of the world, of light, of life, yet one way remained, to seek to God, a very present help in time of trouble. And I did seek after God, but I found him not. I forsook him before, now he forsook me. I could not pray. Then indeed the snares of death were about me. The pains of hell overtook me, yet I struggled for life. And though I had neither words nor thoughts, I lifted up my eyes to the Prince that is highly exalted, and supplied the place of them as I could. And about 4 o'clock he so far took the cup from me that I drank so deeply of it no more." Unquote. Still, Wesley was unable to back out of the situation gracefully. He sent a note initiating a session with Coston. Sophie's uncle lost no time in making clear that he believed John to be a far better match for Sophie, and scolded John for not having intervened. He suggested that he would reopen the question with Sophie, and that John could also do so. John continued to profess a lack of understanding of the messages he was receiving from Sophie and her relatives. The decision had been taken out of his hands, and he wanted it to stay that way. After his conversation with Coston, he did seek conversation with Sophie, after evening prayers. Quote, "Had he then said plainly, 'If you please, you may have her still, but if you won't, another will,' I know not what might have been the event, or had Mr. Delamont left us alone when she came to my house after evening prayers." Unquote. Wesley's continued dramatics regarding this seemingly endless series of close calls now seem quite forced, and the question arises as to the meaning of these continued involvements with Sophie. Upon reflection, Wesley's exaggerated conviction as to the degree of Sophie's commitment of remaining single and to being totally and vulnerably open and frank with him raises another perspective on his unwillingness to accept responsibility for what had occurred. If he was unwilling to see how much seductive behavior he had engaged in, and the degree to which he had promised far more than he ever intended to produce in the way of concrete commitment, he was also unwilling to see that he was now casting Sophie as the chief culprit in the relationship in another sense. Before he had cast her as temptress, and himself as the tempted. Now he was building a case that he had been wronged and that Sophie was indeed the chief master of deceit. After the company had left that evening, he began to challenge her on these grounds. Quote, "Mr. Williamson begged her not to stay after the rest of the company, but she did very readily. He walked to and fro on the outside of the house, with all the signs of strong uneasiness. I told her, 'Miss Sophie, you said yesterday you would take no steps in anything of importance without first consulting me.' She answered earnestly and many times over, 'Why, what could I do? I can't live in that house. I can't bear these shocks. This is quite a sudden thing. I have no particular inclination for Mr. Williamson. I only promised if no objection appeared. But what can I do?' Mr. Williamson, coming in abruptly, took her away and put a short end to our conversation." Unquote. Williamson obviously sensed how shallow Sophie's commitment to him was, but in reality he had little to fear. Sophie was determined to get out of the Custon household, and Wesley, again faced with obvious openings, even at this late stage, had no intention of marrying her. He was rapidly becoming the stern, wronged, and disappointed spiritual director, who, on high principle of course, was soon to retaliate against Sophie in a manner reminiscent of his father's heavy-handed treatment of Hetty. The next day he sought her out again to see if she had changed her mind, and by this time she had finally realized that Wesley did not intend to intervene. He questioned her motivation for her decision, heard her declare her determination to go through with the marriage, advised them to publish the bans properly, and assured them of his continuing friendship and counsel. Wesley was comfortable and satisfied with himself after the conversation. It seemed that he was going to be able to retain his intimacy with Sophie after the wedding, though in a spiritual vein. Such an arrangement had been a common one in Wesley's earlier relationships with women. To his surprise, the very next morning the couple were on their way to Purrisburg and were marrying the following day, Saturday, March 12th, 1738. To John, the irregularity of not having waited until the bans were properly published added insult to injury, and on Friday and Saturday he suffered intense emotional torment. It is significant that on the day of the marriage, Wesley wrote his will. As we have noted above, he associated the termination of the courtship with a death of a sort, and the marriage concretized his passage. What was dying was his own exertion of will, not only that which seemed to be testing the boundaries of the maternal authority. but also that which was expressed in his own striving for a kind of independence or autonomy through his attempt to work out his own salvation. All that remained was for him to compound his sense of failure by acting out in a style reminiscent of his father, the role of a harsh disciplinarian whose motives were questioned by almost the entire colony. When Sophie returned to Savannah, Wesley attempted to continue his role as her pastor and spiritual advisor. For a short time, she came to his services and engaged in conversation with him afterward. Apparently, this continued contact was resented by Williamson, and he pressured her to stay away from Wesley altogether. Wesley, however, became more and more convinced that Sophie had been guilty of lying to him on a number of points, mostly because of the intense gossip which was centering on the entire affair in the colony. He seemed to want to extract a full confession from her that he had been the one who was wronged in the situation, probably in order that he could in good conscience forgive her. But such a confession was not to be forthcoming. Exasperated, Wesley penned the following note on July 5th, outlining his case against her. Quote, "If the sincerity of friendship is best to be known from the painful offices, then there could not be a stronger proof of mine than that I gave you on Sunday, except that which I am going to give you now, and which you may perhaps equally misinterpret. Would you know what I dislike in your past or present behavior? You have always heard my thoughts as freely as you ask them, nay, much more freely. You know it well, and so you shall do, as long as I can speak or write. In your present behavior I dislike, 1. Your neglect of half the public service, which no man living can compel you to. 2. Your neglect of fasting, which you once knew to be a help to the mind, without any prejudice to the body. 3. Your neglect of almost half the opportunity of communicating which you have lately had. But these things are small in comparison of what I dislike in your past behavior. For 1. You told me over and over you had entirely conquered your inclination for Mr. Mellencamp, yet at that very time you had not conquered it. 2. You told me frequently you had no design to marry Mr. Williamson, yet at the very time you spoke you had the design. 3. In order to conceal both these things from me, you went through a course of deliberate dissimulation. Oh, how fallen! How changed! Surely there was a time when in Miss Sophie's life there was no guile. Own these facts, and own your fault, and you will be in my thoughts as if they had never been. If you are otherwise minded, I shall still be your friend, though I cannot expect you should be mine. To Miss Williamson, July 5th. The letter clearly casts Wesley in the role of the wronged suitor, rather, more than in that of the concerned spiritual counselor. Two things are evident in this letter. First, Wesley seems to believe that he was totally innocent of dissimulation in the relationship. This is a relatively clear instance which illustrates the probable degree to which projection figured in his relationship to Sophie, with him dealing with his own deceptiveness by ascribing it to her. The second point to be noticed is his idea of the requirements for reconciliation in a relationship which is estranged. Repenting openly of wrongs done wipes the slate clean and the relationship is restored. Also, clearly implicit in the requirement is a swallowing of one's pride by the transgressor. This soteriology is congruent with that of Susanna's nursery, that implicit in the Aldersgate experience, and that explicit in Wesley's later theology and preaching. We shall have occasion to discuss this further at some length later. We have little indication of Sophie's response to the letter. Little response, that is, except the fact that she miscarried less than a week after receiving it. There's little doubt that Wesley's continued aggressive and intrusive behavior was very disturbing to her. In his note in the journal concerning the event, Wesley himself expresses his awareness that at least some others had made a connection between his treatment of her and the loss of her baby. Monday 11th. Mrs. Williamson miscarried, as Mrs. Coston told one, because of my chiding her 8 days before. As she told another, because of my unkind letter. As she herself said, because of the hurry and concern which Mr. Williamson's illness threw her into. Two things are evident in this entry. The different stories told by her concerning the event seem to back up his conviction regarding her tendency to misrepresent and dissimulate. He had apparently confronted her with the story and expected her to admit to his face that which she had confided to others. Related to this questioning of her is his apparent disavowal of any connection between his continuing pressure and the loss of the child. Again, Wesley simply did not feel responsible for what had happened to Sophie. John was still not satisfied that Sophie was properly penitent. After an absence from Holy Communion, which seemed to Wesley to be altogether too long, on August 7th, 1737, Sophie appeared for the service but was repelled. His account of the incident follows. Sunday 7th. I repelled Mrs. Williamson from the Holy Communion for the reasons specified in my letter of July 5th, as well as for not giving me notice of her design to communicate after having intermitted it for some time. I foresaw the consequences well, but remembered the promise in the epistle for the day, God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that ye are able, but will with the temptation also make a way to escape, that ye may be able to bear it. Unquote. Whether John really understood the violent response which his action was to receive cannot be established, but if Georgia was now seen as the locus of his temptation, and if, as he had told Sophie and Williamson, he was thinking of leaving the colony, his actions can certainly be seen as preparing the way for an escape. Sophie was angry, and her uncle and husband were more so. 2 days later, a warrant was served on John by one of the constables of the colony. It read, Georgia Savannah, to all constables, tithingmen, and others, whom these may concern. You and each of you are hereby required to take the body of John Wesley, clerk, and bring him before one of the bailiffs of the said town to answer the complaint of William Williamson and Sophia his wife, for defaming the said Sophia and refusing to administer to her the sacrament of the Lord's Supper in a public congregation without cause, by which the said William Williamson is damaged £1,000 sterling. And for so doing, this is your warrant, certifying what you are to do in the premises, given under my hand and seal the 8th day of August, 1737, Tho Christi. Coston set out immediately to discredit Wesley. He went through John's letters to Sophie, selecting the most embarrassing and indiscreet segments to read to anyone who would listen. At the same time, Williamson formed an alliance with a disgruntled medical doctor of the colony, one Patrick Tailfer, and participated in writing the angry account which was later published under the title, A True and Historical Narrative of the Colony of Georgia in America. Wesley had never been very popular in the colony, and his actions that summer unleashed a shrill cacophony of attacks upon his character and ministry. Quote, and now to make our subjection the more complete, A new kind of tyranny was this summer, 1737, begun to be imposed upon us, for Mr. John Wesley, who had come over and was received by us as a clergyman of the Church of England, soon discovered that his aim was to enslave our minds, as a necessary preparative for enslaving our bodies. The attendances upon prayers, meetings, and sermons inculcated by him so frequently and at improper hours, inconsistent with necessary labor, especially in an infant colony, tended to propagate a spirit of indolence and of hypocrisy amongst the most abandoned, it being much easier for such persons by an affected shew of religion and adherence to Mr. Wesley's novelties to be provided by his procurement from the public stores, than to use that industry which true religion recommends. But worse than this, they felt they had reason to suspect that Wesley was a papist in disguise. He mistreated the dissenters of the colony and doted over those suspected of leaning towards Roman Catholicism. They sensed that his real plan was to depress their minds and spirits, to break their spirit of liberty, and to humble them, probably in preparation for a civil or ecclesiastical tyranny. To this end, they believed that he engaged spies in the various homes of the colony to report on the behavior of their inhabitants, and those colonists, especially women, who placed themselves in his spiritual care, were required to tell him everything about their most secret actions, including their dreams and personal thoughts. They disliked Coston as much or more than Wesley, but saw the providence of God in the split between the magistrate and the minister. Quote, Mr. Wesley at this time repulsed Mrs. Sophia Williamson, niece to Mr. Coston, from the sacrament. This young lady was by her friends put under the ghostly care of Mr. Wesley, who was pleased to make proposals of marriage to her. These she always rejected, and in some time married Mr. William Williamson of Savannah, much contrary to Mr. Wesley's inclinations. After the said marriage, Mr. Wesley used all means to create a misunderstanding betwixt Mrs. Williamson and her husband, by persuading her that Mr. Williamson had no right to regulate her behavior as to her conversing with him, or attending meetings as formerly. But at last, finding he could gain nothing upon her, and that Mr. Williamson had forbade him any conversation with his wife out of his presence, he took the aforesaid means, by repelling her from the Holy Communion, of shewing his resentment. Mr. Williamson thought himself well founded in an action of damages, and Mr. Wesley, being no longer supported by Mr. Coston, who was highly nettled at the affront put upon his niece, and could now declaim as fluently against spiritual tyranny as any person, was indicted before a grand jury of 44 freeholders, and 13 indictments were found and 13 indictments were found against him. One concerned Mr. Williamson and his spouse, the others concerning the grievances we felt by his measures and the exercise of his ecclesiastical functions as above related. Wesley wanted the court to begin its deliberations immediately, but the dislike of Coston in the colony expressed itself among the jurors, and their hesitation led to the continued postponement of the hearings. A minority of the jury drew up an account more favorable to Wesley, and both the accusation and defense were forwarded to the trustees of the colony in England. The deliberations were at a standstill, but the controversy still raged. John began to be more and more convinced that he should return to England and present his case directly to the trustees. He was informed on November 22nd that he had been branded by the court as a disturber of the public peace. He told Coston that day of his intent to leave immediately for England, and postponed a notice that he was leaving, and posted a notice that he was leaving. When the magistrates got word of this, they ordered him not to leave, and warned all of the officers and sentinels of the colony to prevent him from leaving if he tried to do so. He was now resolute in his decision to escape. Quote, "Being now only a prisoner at large in a place where I knew by experience every day would give fresh opportunity to procure evidence of words I never said and actions I never did, I saw clearly the hour was come for me to fly for my life, leaving this place. And as soon as evening prayers were over, about 8 o'clock, the tide then serving, I shook off the dust of my feet and left Georgia, after having preached the gospel there, with much weakness indeed, and many infirmities, not as I ought, but as I was able, 1 year and nearly 9 months. Oh, that thou hadst known, at least in this thy day, the things which make for thy peace." That night, December 2nd, he left quietly by boat for Perrysburg, then trekked overland to Port Royal. He soon made his way to Charleston, and from there, on December 22nd, 1737, he embarked for England on board the Samuel. The Georgia experiment had proved to be a disastrous failure on all fronts. First of all, the mission to the natives, which had promised to serve so well as a grand act of penance, had never materialized. Secondly, this left him in a role which he had already rejected actively, and which he now rejected passively. If he failed as a parish priest, he did so in the style of his heavy-handed father, and could appeal to his good intentions in the face of that failure. And finally, the failure of his relationship to Sophie indicates his inability to reject dominant maternal images and the control of the internalized maternal authority. He had not expected to be tempted by young women in Georgia, and his discovery of attractive young women there was experienced as a sweet threat to his religious mission. In Sophie, his temptations had been concretized, and he experienced his attraction to her as frightening and almost overwhelming. Yet, the maternal prohibitions proved too powerful for him to break, and he succumbed to obedience. The Georgia excursion had, of course, been an experiment, and, as with many experiments, an unexpected outcome can prove as useful as one that had been anticipated. Georgia gradually came to mean not a locus for a special ministry isolated from the temptations of the world, but the wilderness of temptation itself, a trial by fire, during which he was purified of his illusions about his own righteousness and his tendencies towards self-will. It is appropriate at this point to analyze briefly the ways in which the Georgia fiasco seemed to turn on the issue of will. At the outset, of course, we should remember that it was the aftermath of a mighty struggle of wills between himself and his father that eventually led Wesley to undertake the Georgia mission. Indeed, in Ericksonian terminology, the unifying theme for the Georgia experience might well be understood as initiative versus guilt. It was, in a way, a kind of precocious spiritual initiative which formed one of his main reasons for wanting to stay at Oxford, and which formed the basis for his stated reason for undertaking the mission to the Indians. At the outset of the journey, he had little sense of the self-will and pride which he later came to believe lay at the root of his desire to save his own soul. On board the Samuel, as we shall see below, things looked quite different. The most glaring expression of initiative and accompanying guilt was, of course, his passion for and involvement with Sophie. During the sojourn in Georgia, he came to view his will, even when it manifested itself in the form of spiritual initiative, as hopelessly flawed. Increasingly, it began to dawn on him that his own initiative had to die, that it could not be trusted, that his only hope lay in resignation to the will and initiative of God. He had sought to work out his own salvation in fear and trembling, and it was that very fear which made him begin to question the adequacy of his faith. He had sought to work out his own salvation in fear and trembling, and it was that very fear which made him begin to question the adequacy of his faith. Even as early as the voyage to Georgia on board the Simmons, he had been impressed with the fearlessness of the Moravians. The uneasy feeling that he lacked something that the Germans had led him to become very close to them throughout the time of his stay in the colony. His conversation with Spangenberg on his arrival in Georgia had posed the questions which occupied him during his ministry there, and which now, on leaving it, obsessed him. Quote, I asked Mr. Spangenberg's advice with regard to myself, to my own conduct. He told me he could say nothing till he had asked me 2 or 3 questions. Do you know yourself? Have you the witness within yourself? Does the Spirit of God bear witness with your spirit that you are a child of God? I was surprised, and knew not what to answer. He observed it, and asked, Do you know Jesus Christ? I paused, and said, I know he is the Savior of the world. True, he replied, but do you know he has saved you? I answered, I hope he has died to save me. He only added, Do you know yourself? I said, I do, but I fear they were vain words. Unquote. Now, on leaving the colony in disgrace and despair, the same issues were on his mind. Though he busied himself in ministering to the ship's company, he was engaged in a ruthless self-analysis. Quote, Sunday 8th. In the fullness of my heart, I wrote the following words. By the most infallible proofs, inward feeling, I am convinced, 1. Of unbelief, having no such faith in Christ as will prevent my heart from being troubled, which it could not be, if I believed in God, and rightly believed also in him. 2. Of pride, throughout my life past, and as much as I thought I had, what I find I have not. 3. Of gross irrecollection, inasmuch as in a storm I cry to God every moment, in a calm not. Of levity and luxuriancy of spirit, recurring whenever the pressure is taken off, and appearing by my speaking words not tending to edify, but most by my manner of speaking of my enemies. Lord, save, or I perish. Save me. 1. By such a faith as implies peace in life and in death. 2. By such humility as may fill my heart from this hour for every, with a piercing sense, having evidently built without a foundation. 3. By such a recollection as may cry to thee every moment, especially when all is calm. Give me faith, or I die. Give me a lowly spirit. Otherwise, mi non sit suave vivere. Translated, it is not pleasant for me to live. 4. By steadiness, seriousness, sobriety of spirit, avoiding, as fire, every word that tendeth not
to edifying, and never speaking of any who oppose me, or sin against God, without all my own sins set in array before my face. He continued his soul searching and was not at all happy about what he found there. His lament was perhaps best expressed in his sorrowful realization, quote, I went to America to convert the Indians, but oh, who shall convert me? Unquote. On February 1st, 1738, Wesley landed again on English soil. At this point, though he later questioned these thoughts, he was convinced that he had never been converted. In an account of his reasoning on the matter, he takes note of his scholarly accomplishments in the area of divinity, his good works, his sacrifices, and concludes that he is still a child of wrath. He was convinced that his whole heart was altogether corrupt and abominable, and that he had no hope except that of being justified, not by any claim of righteousness on his own part, but that which is through the faith of Christ, the righteousness which is God by faith. Wesley went on to describe the kind of faith which he longed for and which he lacked. Quote, the faith I want, the faith of a son, is a sure trust and confidence in God, that through the merits of Christ my sins are forgiven, and I reconciled to the favor of God. I want that faith which St. Paul recommends to all the world, and especially in his epistle to the Romans, that faith which enables everyone that hath it to cry out, I live not, but Christ liveth in me. And the life which I now live, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me, and who gave himself for me. I want that faith which none can have without knowing that he hath it. I want that faith which none can have without knowing that he hath it, though many imagine they have it, who have it not. For whosoever hath it is freed from sin. The whole body of sin is destroyed in him. He is freed from fear, having peace with God through Christ, and rejoicing in hope of the glory of God. And he is freed from doubt, having the love of God shed abroad in his heart through the Holy Ghost, which is given unto him, which Spirit itself beareth witness with his spirit, that he is a child of God. The trials of Georgia had finalized the process which Susanna Wesley had initiated and facilitated in the Epworth parsonage, the breaking down of John's self-will. The fires of passion and even of spiritual initiative had burned him out, and he now felt himself to be a cold, dead cinder, a resigned self waiting for the Spirit of God to move in him and to warm his heart. Vindication. On his arrival back in England, Wesley did not allow his intensive self-analysis to interfere with his continued work as a minister. He read prayers and counseled with travelers in the inns where he stayed during his journey to London. A hint that his supposed intentions of returning to Georgia to attempt once again the ministry to the natives were soon to be supplanted may be found in his response to the first Englishmen he encountered in providing religious leadership again in his homeland. Quote, I here read prayers and explained the second lesson to a few of those who were called Christians, but were indeed more savage in their behavior than the wildest Indians I have yet met with. Unquote. Wesley was soon to become convinced that England provided heathen enough without returning to Georgia, and that an extraordinary ministry did not have to focus entirely on foreign missions. At this point, however, Wesley was too depressed and disoriented by the events in Georgia and his realizations about himself to be much concerned with any grand designs. By the 3rd of February, he was back in London, renewing his relationships with family and friends. He met with Charles and soon visited with his mother. After discussions with a number of his old acquaintances, and after telling them the circumstances surrounding his unexpected arrival, he realized that he could no longer postpone his encounter with the trustees of the colony. He met with them several times and defended himself as best he could against the accusations which had been made against him. Nevertheless, in spite of his best efforts and some supporting letters which he had with him, the trustees saw fit to remove him from his appointment to the colony. After these no doubt embarrassing and humiliating sessions with the trustees, he was able to continue with his preaching and discussions with friends. Since he had just returned from a colony which was of great interest to many people at that time, he received many invitations to preach in various London churches. The following journal notation was to be repeated in almost identical form many times in the ensuing months. Quote, "In the afternoon I was desired to preach at St. John the Evangelist. I did so on those strong words, 'If any man be in Christ, he is a new creature.' I was afterwards informed many of the best in the parish were so offended that I was not to preach there any more." Unquote. Much of the old creature in John had already passed away, although he was not at all sure whether there was going to be a new one. Still, a substantial residue of the old merit-hoarding self remained, and when myriad listeners were repelled by his righteousness, he counted the points in the plus column as being part of that persecution which true followers of Christ are bound to endure. He was gratified to find a warm welcome from numerous old friends, but it was the making of a new friend in the person of the Moravian Peter Böhler which was to prove most important in his continuing personal and theological development. Böhler and several of his friends had just arrived in London from Germany, and, since they knew no one in England, Wesley assisted them in finding lodging for their stay. The young German had formerly been a Lutheran, but had more recently been ordained into the ministry of the Moravian Brethren. What Spangenberg had been to Wesley in Georgia, Böhler was to pick up and carry much further in England. It was quite natural that Böhler and Wesley immediately seemed to have an affinity for each other, since Böhler was on his way to a ministry in Georgia. The attraction on Wesley's part, however, went much deeper than that. He had continued to ruminate on the rock-like trust and assurance which appeared to be available to the Moravians he had met previously, and which seemed to elude his grasp. Now he had an opportunity to continue his inquiries under the leadership of this young man with whom he seemed to be able to relate so easily. He told Böhler of his experience with the Moravians in Georgia and of his intention to visit Herrnhut the following summer. Böhler liked Wesley immediately, and though he believed John's understanding of the faith left something to be desired, he hoped that through his own influence and that of the visit to the Moravian homeland, Wesley might become a full-fledged member of the Brethren. Wesley lost no time in engaging Böhler in extensive discussions of the nature of the soteriological economy at every opportunity. Böhler, after having had time to locate Wesley's particular stage of spiritual and theological development, proved himself to be fully as direct and confrontive as Spangenberg had been. Quote, "All this time I conversed much with Peter Böhler, but I understood him not, and least of all when he said, Mi frater, ex quinda est ista tua philosophia. My brother, that philosophy of yours must be purged away. Unquote. Bowler, on among other things, was probably referring to the way in which Wesley continued to intellectualize at an abstract level regarding the nature of grace and faith. The Moravian intended to show Wesley and the other young Englishmen with whom he was involved that faith was indeed central, but that its presence or absence could not be established by abstract reasoning or logic applied to the presence or absence of good works. Wesley was becoming more open to Bowler's position, but still on the level of the abstract. With regard to his own practice, he seemed to be still convinced that when his preaching or spiritual counseling proved less than effective, it was due to his own lack of discipline, rather than anything more basic. Quote, with regard to my own behavior, I now renewed and wrote down my former resolutions. 1. To use absolute openness and unreserve with all I should converse with. 2. To labor after continual seriousness, not willingly indulging myself in any the least levity of behavior or in laughter. No, not for a moment. 3. To speak no word which does not tend to the glory of God. In particular, not to talk of worldly things. Others may, nay, must. But what is that to thee? And 4. To take no pleasure which does not tend to the glory of God, thanking God every moment for all I do take, and therefore rejecting every sort and degree of it which I feel I cannot so thank him in and for. Wesley's punitive conscience was still very much at work, and the screws of repression remained as tight as ever. Nevertheless, Bowler's continual hammering at the necessity of saving faith, a present personal relationship with Christ, through which one would know pardon and assurance, and not merely speculate about it, had taken its toll on Wesley. On Sunday, March 5th, 1738, John was finally totally and irrevocably convinced that he did not have the faith which was necessary for salvation. He had already realized this intellectually, but now it struck him with renewed force. Immediately it struck into my mind, leave off preaching. How can you preach to others who have not faith yourself? I asked Bowler whether he thought I should leave it off or not. He answered, by no means. I asked, but what can I preach? He said, preach faith till you have it, and then, because you have it, you will preach faith. Unquote. Here again Bowler was striking at the heart of Wesley's religious egoism. For the Moravian, the power of God's word of grace had an objective reality and efficacious power that did not depend on the subjective condition of the preacher, no matter how petty and self-centered that subjective condition might be. Wesley was experiencing a great deal of resistance to this idea that God might indeed use him without his own spiritual house being in obsessive and compulsive order. Nevertheless, he continued preaching in spite of his feelings of unworthiness. Bowler's next task was to renew his frontal attacks on the Wesley brothers' tendency to be preoccupied with what they could do to fight sin. Both John and Charles were present at this meeting, which took place on March 23rd. For years, their masters had been among other proponents of a rigorous ascetic bridling of the will, Thomas A. Kempis and William Law. But Bowler constantly countered their image of Christ as the ideal with his of Christ as Savior. Wesley finally concluded that Bowler's view would bear testing as to whether it was scripturally sound. He was amazed at what he could understand of what the Moravian was saying. Both holiness and happiness could issue forth in his life if he had a living faith. Within a month, Wesley had been convinced that Bowler's understanding of faith was fundamentally correct. Quote, I met Peter Bowler once more. I had now no objection to what he said of the nature of faith, namely, that it is, to use the words of our church, a sure trust and confidence which a man hath in God, that through the merits of Christ his sins are forgiven and he reconciled to the favor of God. Neither could I deny either the happiness or holiness which he described as fruits of this living faith. The Spirit itself beareth witness with our spirit that we are the children of God, and he that believeth hath the witness in himself. Fully convinced me of the former, and he that believeth hath the witness in himself, fully convinced me of the former. As whatsoever is born of God doth not commit sin, and whosoever believeth is born of God did of the latter. Wesley had now tested Bowler's position by delving deeply into his own Greek New Testament, and had found that it had stood the test. Bowler was directing him toward that kind of faith which he had said that he wanted, the faith of a son, and his objections were becoming fewer in number with each passing day. Yet he still had one principal problem with Bowler's point of view. He simply could not stomach the German's espousal of instantaneous conversion. Again, he searched the scriptures, and to his amazement he found a great deal of evidence for the existence of such conversions in the early church. Bowler had backed him into a corner. Quote, I had but one retreat left, namely, thus I grant God wrought in the first pages of Christianity, but the times are changed. What reason have I to believe he works in the same manner now? But on Sunday the 23rd I was beat out of this retreat too, by the concurring evidence of several living witnesses, who testified God had thus wrought in themselves, giving them in a moment such a faith in the blood of his Son as translated them out of darkness into light, out of sin and fear into holiness and happiness. Here ended my disputing. I could now only cry out, Lord, help thou my unbelief. Unquote. Bowler had marshaled his heaviest spiritual artillery at the critical moment, and John found that he had no defense left. He was now clear about what he lacked, and very depressed about his condition as he now understood it. He told his brother Charles about his newest insights, and found him still very resistant to the Moravian's point of view. Bowler, on the other hand, had not given up on the younger brother, and took his advocacy into combat with Charles' doubts. Again, the German was not to be resisted, and on May 3rd the reluctant Charles had capitulated. Bowler now felt that he had done all that was humanly possible to prepare the way for God's action in the life of the Wesleys. He had stripped away their defenses with all the skill of a tender surgeon, and, from his point of view, they now stood naked, awaiting a move only God could make. He then left London to depart for his work in the New World. He summed up his case as God's advocate in a letter mailed to John before embarking. Quote, I love you greatly and think much of you in my journey, wishing and praying that the tender mercies of Jesus Christ the crucified, whose bowels were moved towards you more than 6,000 years ago, may be manifested to your soul. That you may taste and then see how exceedingly the Son of God has loved you, and loves you still, and that you may continually trust in him, and feel his life in yourself. Beware of the sin of unbelief, and if you have not conquered it yet, see that you conquer it this very day, through the blood of Jesus Christ. Delay not, I beseech you, to believe in your Jesus Christ, but so put him in mind of his promises to poor sinners, that he may not be able to refrain from doing for you what he hath done for so many others. Oh, how great, how inexpressible, how unexhausted is his love! Surely he is now ready to help, and nothing can offend him but our unbelief. Belief, therefore, greet in my name and your brother Charles and Hall, and admonish one another to believe, and then to walk circumspectly in the sight of God, to fight lawfully against the devil and the world, and to crucify and to tread all sin under your feet, as far as you are permitted through the grace of the second Adam, whose life exceeds the death of the first Adam, and whose grace far surpasses the corruption and damnation of the first Adam. Unquote. The Moravian had done his work well, and Charles was the first to experience the results of his long and tedious teaching. The younger Wesley had been having periodic bouts of ill health, and was still bedfast from one of his attacks when he experienced his conversion to a saving faith. John, however, was still without such an experience. His depression continued without any relief. He continued his preaching, and continued to find that wherever he preached from his new understanding, the pulpits were closed to him. In a state of deep dejection, Wesley wrote a lengthy letter describing his spiritual state. The letter is written with such an intensity that it seems to be an outpouring of bitterness concerning his own unworthiness and lack of faith, using the friend for a sounding board. He begins by acknowledging the strange and incomprehensible character of a God who would use someone like him to forward divine purposes, but he does not question the fact that God continues to use him. He believes the law of God is just, but is convinced that he deserves nothing from him. All of those things which he had previously considered to be good works, he now believes to be simply further evidence of his corruption. God is a fire which has every right and reason to consume him. But he does have some hope in the promise of God that whoever believes will be saved. But he does have some hope in the promise of God that whoever believes will be saved. The last part of the letter is a prayer which calls upon Jesus for help in emptying himself and in coming to a state of trusting faith. The next entry in Wesley's journal is presented by him as a narrative which can put the events of Wednesday, May 24th in context. The narrative is a summary of his spiritual pilgrimage from his childhood to this critical moment. In it, the central theme is his continual dependence on his own works and his own righteousness for his hope of salvation. He narrates the influences which gradually changed his mind concerning his goal and what was required of him. This was a justifying, saving faith, a full reliance on the blood of Christ shed for me, a trust in him as my Christ, as my sole justification, sanctification, and redemption. He notes that prior to Bowler's influence he had desired a true and living faith, but that he had still failed to fix his hope on the right object. Previously, he had meant only faith in God, not faith in or through Christ. Bowler's tutelage had corrected this, and he now looked to Christ for the help which he needed. On May 24th, he found that experience which he had been seeking. In the evening of that day he went without enthusiasm to a small group meeting which was located on Aldersgate Street. One of the members of the group was reading from Luther's preface to the Epistle to the Romans. Quote, About a quarter before 9, while he was describing the change which God works in the heart through faith in Christ, I felt my heart strangely warmed. I felt I did trust in Christ, Christ alone, for salvation, and an assurance was given me that he had taken away my sins, even mine, and saved me from the law of sin and death." Unquote. His temptations had not ended, however, and almost immediately he wondered why he was not experiencing joy. He was taught at that time that though joy usually accompanies the beginning of faith, it does not always do so. This eased his concerns somewhat, but after returning home, his fears continued. Now, rather than allowing himself to sink into a deep depression, he prayed for grace to assist him, and found some solace. Quote, "And herein I found the difference between this and my former state chiefly consisted. I was striving, yea, fighting, with all my might under the law, as well as under grace. But then I was sometimes, if not often, conquered. Now I was always conqueror." Unquote. A close reading of the journal, as we shall see below, raises some doubts as to whether Wesley was now always conqueror. Still, there's little doubt that the experience was in fact an important one for Wesley. Popular Wesley biography has taken this event and interpreted it as the decisive event in Wesley's personal and spiritual development. Wesley himself evidently wanted to present the experience as the occasion of a most significant upturn in his psychic and spiritual condition. We must inquire, however, into the nature of the change which had occurred. This intense experience of the grace of God, following so closely upon the failure of an important experiment and grand act of penance, raises the question of the possible relationship between the failure and the forgiveness. Two failures of real magnitude to John occurred in Georgia. He had failed to carry out his extraordinary ministry to the heathen, thus aborting his project of penance to the paternal authority. Maternal expectations of an extraordinary role for him had also been thwarted by this contingency, and, in addition, his unexpected struggle with the carnal was a head-on conflict with maternal prohibitions. We have noted above that Susanna was satisfied with the child's obedience of her rules, and granted approval even of a failure when good intentions were manifest. Samuel, on the other hand, was mysteriously ambivalent and often made fun of John precisely because he kept the rules and obeyed so well. And Samuel took no note whatever of good intentions. Even a successful carrying out of an act of penance could not be depended upon to effect a reconciliation with the capricious father. Samuel simply did not have the charity, as John had put it, which was due even to wicked persons. It is significant that the qualities which Samuel lacked were precisely those which Wesley had come to attribute to the Heavenly Father. Wesley, at quite an early age, had formulated an understanding through the counsel of his parents that justification is made possible solely through the merits of Christ. He knew, too, that the work of Christ had to be appropriated by man. The important part, however, of his early understanding was that the conditions of salvation were faith and a sincere though imperfect obedience to the law of God. Faith here was conceived of more as an intellectual assent than as a personal relationship of trust. Yet equally as important was the emphasis on the fundamental necessity of the subjugation of the will, purity of intention, in fulfilling the law. The latter was, of course, much more difficult to deal with than the requirement of assent. but Wesley committed himself to seek total devotion and obedience. The training of his parents was supplemented and not contradicted by Wesley's reading of Jeremy Taylor, Thomas A. Kempis, and William Law. He had set out to prove himself worthy of receiving the benefits of the sacrifice of Christ, but he was to find this struggle very problematic. Just as he had trouble knowing where he stood with his Father, even when he had done his very best, he feared that he had not yet pleased his heavenly Father either. Georgia had intensified his feelings of inadequacy and his fear that all of his works and feigned righteousness would meet only with God's wrath. He had found his will far more infected with carnality than he had previously believed, and now his hope that he might find favor with God was greatly weakened. It was not until he had continued his learning from the Moravians, begun in Georgia, under Peter Böhler, that this image of God began to change. Now a different kind of faith seemed to become a possibility, that of a son rather than a servant. We should remember in this context that reconciliation with Samuel had always required John serving him as a scribe or working on some other task which the Father assigned. The new image of God, facilitated by Böhler and actualized in the Aldersgate experience, was of a heavenly Father who was not only trustworthy, but whose love reached out to man, even in his imperfection, and made man want to obey him. After Aldersgate, Wesley was no longer inhibited by a capricious, unloving, unreasonable Father. He now had a heavenly Father who was not only just, but loving and gracious. The demand of the drudgeries of constantly proving oneself and doing penance after having failed seemed to have been replaced by an opportunity for joyous obedience. It is clear that one can discern in the superstructures of the new soteriological economy elements of the moral order of Susanna's nursery. For if the potency of the capricious paternal authority had finally been laid to rest, that of the maternal authority not only continued in the form of a search for a providential role, but also was transformed and elevated into the demanding yet gracious image of the Heavenly Father. Wesley's theological development and the psychosocial infrastructures of his mature thought will be analyzed in some depth in the next chapter. It should suffice at this point to note two other points of interest in reflecting on the significance of the conversion experience. First, Wesley's obsessive-compulsive, over-controlling style with regard to what he considers as being permissible expressions of self-will, including feelings, remains intact. He continues to be suspicious of taking pleasure in anything which is not completely innocuous. For him, the adjudication of what qualifies under this rubric is determined by the question of whether the enjoyment is directly related to his religious mission. In this sense, then, the law, both psychological and theological, is still functional, and rigorous obedience is seen as a natural outgrowth of an experience of justification by grace through faith. Second, and closely related to the above, the issue of initiative versus guilt is resolved, finally not through rebellion against authority, but in submission to it and identification with it. The face or image of authority is altered so that it deserves obedience. There is now no good reason to resist it. The intrusive authority is now welcomed into his being to replace his perverted will. Whereas before, good works were a burden which might or might not elicit an expression of approval and favor from the divine authority. Now, the expression of encouragement and favor precedes the works in his initiative. Precedes Now the expression of encouragement and favor precedes the works, and his initiative is now far less inhibited by feelings of fear and acute uncertainty. His self will and perverted initiative had led to failure in Georgia, yet in a manner reminiscent of the Epworth nursery, when his good intentions and repentance were presented to the relevant authority, he found pardon. And in that pardon, he had concrete evidence that he was a son and not a servant.
While reflecting on the assurance of the availability of pardon, we should also be aware of the cost which that same pardon elicited prior to its being granted. As a child, Wesley's expressions of will brought punishment, not pardon, and this dynamic continued in his emerging soteriological economy. Levity or pleasures which could even remotely be construed to be worldly in nature continued to be forbidden. It is not surprising, then, that Wesley had little room in his heart for the joy which he wanted so much to experience. For him, real religious commitment issued in a radical seriousness, and Wesley continued to be suspicious of anyone who manifested the least lightheartedness. Now he felt he had peace with God. But the enemy injected a fear. If thou dost believe, why is there not a more sensible change? As the days passed, he became more and more concerned about his lack of a continuing experience of joy. Bowler had taught him that justification would bring with it a full experience of assurance and accompanying joy. He finally decided that he would embark on his planned trip to Herrnhut to see if he could find some answers there. On his way to Herrnhut, he stopped for a brief visit with Count Zinzendorf at Marienborn. There he was to find the first of several confirmations by Moravians that his partial assurance and seeming lack of joy did not nullify the reality of his experience of justification. His first reassurance came from the Count himself. Wesley has summarized the teaching he heard at that time regarding justification under 8 points. 1. Justification is the forgiveness of sins. 2. The moment a man flies to Christ, he is justified. 3. And has peace with God, but not always joy. 4. Nor perhaps may he know he is justified till long after. 5. For the assurance of it is distinct from justification itself. 6. But others may know he is justified by his power over sin, by his seriousness, his love of his brethren, and his hunger and thirst after righteousness, which alone prove the spiritual life to be begun. 7. To be justified is the same thing as to be born of God. 8. When a man is awakened, he is begotten of God, and his fear and sorrow, the sense of the wrath of God, are the pangs of the new birth. Unquote. In the Count's teaching, he found a rationale under which he could accept his continuing lack of joy without questioning his experience of justification. Zinzendorf was contradicting the words of Bowler, which had made his experience up to now seem inadequate. After arriving at Herrnhut, he was to find further confirmation of the validity of his Aldersgate experience. This came in a series of talks with 11 of the members of the Moravian community. The most intense impact on Wesley was made by the carpenter Christian David. In listening to his sermons and discussing privately with him, Wesley again heard the encouraging word that even a weak faith is still faith, and that the experience of the full fruits of that new trust in God may take a while to develop. Now he was confident that he had an adequate theological explanation for what he experienced during the doldrums which followed Aldersgate. The entire experience was proving a heady one for Wesley. He had for years tried to learn as much as possible about primitive Christianity and to exemplify its spirit in his own life. Here, it seemed, he was in the presence of a community that had a sense of its oneness with the early church. Wesley's identification with the early Christian community and its leaders is manifest in two letters written on August 4th, 1738, one to his brother Charles and another to James Hutton. In a sensitive analysis of these letters, Martin Schmidt has noted the affected imitation of the style and organization of a Pauline epistle. An ironic aspect of these letters is his pompously worded exhortation to his colleagues that they use great plainness of speech. Schmidt also notes Wesley's use of phrasing, which was very typical of Zinzendorf. That he engaged in such posturing at this critical time is of great interest from a psychological perspective. It is evidence that he had not given up his goal of a very extraordinary ministry. Here, he is identifying with the Apostle Paul and with a corresponding figure, Zinzendorf, in this contemporary recapitulation of the early church. His evaluation of the experience at Herrnhut is evident in the following journal entry. Quote, I would gladly have spent my life here, but my master, calling me to labor in another part of his vineyard, on Monday the 14th I was constrained to take my leave of this happy place, Martin Dober and a few others of the brethren walking with us about an hour. Oh, when shall this Christianity cover the earth, as the waters cover the sea? Unquote. The accounts written before leaving Herrnhut, both in journal entries and in letters, had been almost, if not completely, unequivocal in their praise of the Moravian community. After his return to London, however, he began to have some questions regarding the way of life which he had observed. At that time, he wrote a letter which was never mailed, and which was published only after his open break with the Moravians. In it, he intended to confront his German friends with some questions which were highly critical of their leader's dominance in their lives, and which raised the issue of the relative depths of their religious commitment. Among them were these queries, quote, Is not the Count all in all? Are not the rest mere shadows, calling him Rabbi, almost implicitly both believing and obeying him? Is there not something of levity in your behavior? Are you in general serious enough? Are you not straitened in your love? Do you love your enemies and wicked men as yourselves? Do you not mix human wisdom with divine, joining worldly prudence to heavenly? Do you not use cunning, guile, or dissimulation in many cases? Are you not of a close, dark, reserved temper and behavior? Unquote. If his criticisms were accurate, it may well have been because he had become used to finding these same faults in himself. and could easily transfer the focus of his discerning eye to others. That he did not mail the letter, nevertheless, may indicate that he had some doubt as to the accuracy of his perceptions. At any rate, these comments suggest not only that he was continuing to identify with the Count, but that he was projecting his doubts about his own motives and behavior onto the brethren. In a largely discredited bit of lore concerning his days at Charterhouse, Wesley is said to have remarked, "Better to rule in hell than to serve in heaven." Even if this anecdote is apocryphal, it expresses a characteristic of Wesley that is clearly evident both before and after the Aldersgate experience: the drive to dominate and control not only himself, but other people. It should be clear from this that Wesley's identification with Zinzendorf was multifaceted, and included at least an envy of his position of dominance and leadership of a group which was quite extraordinary in his mind. The issues of dominance, control, and purity of motivation are central to his criticisms, and Wesley himself was struggling with each of these. The Moravians could not be faulted on one point, however: they had joy. Wesley continued to be troubled by his lack of joy and a sensible love for God. Although on his return to England he had continued preaching the glad tidings of salvation, he was agonizing in private. He still felt that he had been truly pardoned, and saw evidence that in spite of what he lacked on the experiential level, the grace of God was present and seemed to use him more than ever. On September 30th, he had the surprising and encouraging experience of helping a man to face the depths of his wickedness and to receive pardon. The man had shown evidence of a total change in the orientation of his life, and, probably more important to John, had begun to experience the joy of his newfound trust in God. A little more than a week later, Wesley read a book which probably magnified in his mind the significance of the conversion which he had helped to bring about. As Wesley put it in the journal entry, "In walking, I read the truly surprising narrative of the conversions lately wrought in and about the town of Northampton in New England. Surely this is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes." He took an abstract from this account by Jonathan Edwards and included it in a letter to a friend. The friend's response initiated another crisis of self-doubt in Wesley that rivaled any that he had had before in severity. Following St. Paul's directive to examine yourself, whether ye be in the faith, Wesley asked himself once more the ways in which he was a new creature, and found himself lacking. Although he had some of the fruit of the Spirit, he could not find the presence of other important qualities. Quote, "I cannot find in myself the love of God or of Christ. Hence my deadness and wanderings in public prayer. Hence it is that even in the Holy Communion I have frequently no more than a cold attention. Again, I have not that joy in the Holy Ghost, no settled, lasting joy." Unquote. The lack of these important aspects of the assurance of faith led Wesley to conclude that he was not yet, in the full sense of the words, in Christ a new creature. He took some comfort in the fact that he still believed that his sins had been forgiven and that he was reconciled to God in a real way. Wesley may have been considering whether one with a faith as weak as his might expect to lead a revival in England which was similar to that in New England. He had already had one man converted under his ministry, but he needed assurance that his work too was really of God. During the following days, he continued his self-analysis and found nothing to change the judgments he had made on previous days. He found that he still desired creature happiness. Quote, "My soul is almost continually running out after one creature or another and imagining, how happy should I be in such or such a condition? I have more pleasure in eating and drinking and in the company of those I love than I have in God. I have a relish for earthly happiness. I have not a relish for heavenly." Unquote. He was convinced that though his ultimate purposes were directed toward the proper object, in many ways conflicting purposes seemed to smuggle themselves into his motivations in devious ways. Quote, "This is my ultimate design, but intermediate designs are continually creeping in upon me. Designs, though often disguised, of pleasing myself, of doing my own will. Designs wherein I do not eye God, at least not him singly." Were his desires those of a new creature? He could not honestly conclude that they were. They seemed to be very much like his designs or purposes, very mixed. Quote, "My great desire is to have Christ formed in my heart by faith, but little desires are daily stealing into my soul, and so my great hopes and fears have respect to God, but 1,000 little ones creep in between them." Unquote. In the conclusion of this searching and ruthlessly honest letter, he summarized his bitter awareness of his conflicts and ambivalence as they express themselves in his lack of purity of intention. Quote, "Again, my desires, passions, and inclinations in general are mixed, having something of Christ and something of earth. I love you, for instance, but my love is only partly spiritual and partly natural. Something of my own cleaves to that which is of God. Nor can I divide the earthly part from the heavenly." Unquote. It should be evident from this candid account that we do not have to justify speaking in terms of sublimation or displacement in discussing Wesley's penchant for gratifying his needs for love, intimacy, and the expression of self-will and initiative through religious channels. Here, Wesley himself has given us a good phenomenological description of these processes as they are present in his experience. He was under tremendous conflict, and though he continued to actively preach faith, he did not experience the change in himself and the assurance which he sought. 2 weeks after the above account, his self-scrutiny was equally ruthless. His friends had considered him mad a year before when he had said that he was not a Christian. He still believed that he did not have in his life the true marks of a converted Christian. The real Christian manifested love, peace, and joy. Quote, "But these I have not. I have not any love of God. I do not love either the Father or the Son. Do you ask, how do I know whether I love God? I answer by another question. How do you know whether you love me? Why, as you know whether you are hot or cold, you feel this moment that you do or do not love me, and I feel this moment I do not love God, which therefore I know because I feel it." Unquote. His desire to love and be loved to have real intimacy with other human beings, to enjoy the pleasures of human life, were a continuing drive, which again he acknowledged honestly. Quote, "For I love the world. I desire the things of the world, some or other of them, and have done all my life. I have always placed some part of my happiness in some or other of the things that are seen, particularly in meat and drink, and in the company of those I loved. For many years I have been, yea, and still am, hankering after a happiness in loving and being loved by one or another, and in these I have from time to time taken more pleasure than in God." Unquote. He was stuck in a spiritual rut. Bowler's formula had not worked. Assurance and confirmation that his ministry was truly of God would have to come from some other source than his internal state. At this point, we should remember that, according to Erickson, it is not enough for a young man to find an integrating ideology. He must find an institution, a role, through which his embryonic identity can find social sanction and support. We have seen above that for Wesley, the providential role had long been an object of first priority in his search for selfhood. The account of the exciting events in New England suggested a possible role for him, but his continuing spiritual crisis raised a serious question as to whether or not one with his shortcomings could be used by God in such a wondrous way. It was not until George Whitefield's return from America that the opportunity to test his role as the leader of a revival would present itself. Whitefield was convinced that the time had come for the revival to begin in England, and had initiated a series of services among the Bristol colliers. When it became necessary for him to leave the Bristol area, he pressed Wesley to take his place in the field preaching. Wesley was highly resistant to the idea. The practice was very irregular and particularly repugnant to the more conservative principles regarding Anglican church order, which his brother Charles adhered to even more closely than John. It is perhaps significant that at this time, death re-enters the picture. His colleagues seemed to feel that going to Bristol would prove fatal to John. Wesley's response is a revealing one. He enters into his journal at this point the letter which he had previously written to his father to reject the Epworth living. In it, we should remember, he contrasts the relative claims of the authority of a parent, in this case his father, with those of a call of providence. The entry is a clear indication that the opportunity for an extraordinary role would take precedence over any authority which was of man. In one of his letters written from Herrnhut, he had affirmed that he would call no man master in faith, practice, or discipline. This affirmation, in truth, covered his father, Count Zinzendorf, his brothers, and later the bishops of the Anglican Church. He had in fact only one earthly master, Susanna, and he had by now so thoroughly internalized the structures, values, and intentions of her authority that he was soon to become her spiritual parent and, more important, that of thousands of his fellow Englishmen. Finally, after having convinced his colleagues in London that he should accept Whitefield's invitation, he departed for Bristol. Arriving there on March 31st, 1739, he found himself still a little troubled at the prospect of field preaching. In the event of the following day, he led a society in an exposition of the Sermon on the Mount. In a revealing comment, he noted that these passages could serve as a remarkable precedent for field preaching. We have noted above his identification with Paul the Apostle. Now we see him identifying with the person and ministry of Jesus. The beginning of the following important entry indicates with little room for doubt that in his resignation and submission he had been clearing the way for his exaltation into a most extraordinary ministry. Quote, Monday the 2nd. At 4 in the afternoon I submitted to be more vile, and proclaimed in the highways the glad tidings of salvation, speaking from a little eminence in a ground adjoining to the city, to about 3,000 people. The scripture on which I spoke was this: Is it possible any one should be ignorant that it is fulfilled in every true minister of Christ? The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he hath anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He hath sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives, and recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty them that are bruised, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord. Unquote. He had had his temptation in the wilderness, had been claimed as a son, and now preached his own Sermon on the Mount. On a mount. His need to enter the comment regarding the fulfillment of the Scripture in the life of every true minister probably indicates that he had an uneasy awareness of the degree of his identification. When John's followers had asked Jesus if he were the one that they had been led to expect, the scriptural account in Matthew 11:2-5 portrays Jesus as pointing to the concrete manifestations of his ministry as indication that it had been confirmed by God. In the following month, Wesley too was to have his evidence. Great crowds were coming to hear him preach. He was treated like a saint and even acknowledged as a prophet. But more than that, many persons were convicted of their sins, repented, and found peace and joy through their new faith. In a letter to his brother Samuel, written on May 10th, his new conviction that his work had been found favorable in God's sight is evident. Quote, I am one of many witnesses of this matter of fact, that God does now make good his promise daily, very frequently during a representation. How made I know not, but not to the outward eye, of Christ, either hanging on the cross or standing on the right hand of God. And this I know to be of God, because from that hour the person so affected is a new creature, both as to his inward tempers and outward life. Unquote. He goes on to relate the conversion of John Hayden, who, like many others, had found both joy and love through his ministry. The reviving impact of these events upon Wesley himself is evident in the closing paragraph of the letter. John states that his health, which had bothered him a good deal in earlier years, was now as good as it had been at any time in his memory. The revival had begun, and Wesley himself had been revived in a remarkable way. Buller had told him that he should preach faith until he had it, but he had failed in this. Now, he had preached faith until others had it. and the assurance which he could not gain through a sensible change in himself, he now gleaned from that which his ministry was facilitating in the lives of others. It is evident that here at Bristol Wesley found the long-sought providential role and the necessary confirmation of the extraordinary personal and professional identity which had been his lifelong goal. Let us examine some of the factors which made this role seem so acceptable to him. If Aldersgate had marked the end of the inhibiting effects of the paternal authority, it did not do away with the necessity of dealing with parental identifications. It is perhaps significant to note that his father had also engaged in fantasies of becoming a traveling evangelist in the British Isles. His paternal grandfather had in fact been an itinerant preacher who engaged in an irregular ministry and came into conflict with ecclesiastical authority. By engaging in field preaching, Wesley was able to claim a role which represented a positive identification with his father and which, in its irregular style, reenacted the life and style of religious leadership of his paternal grandfather. The role, given its similarity to traditional descent, was in effect an affirmation not only of the negative identity of the father, who converted from descent, but also of those tendencies of Susanna toward irregular behavior in the dissenting mode. Therefore, Wesley had found a role which enabled him to integrate identifications gleaned from 2 generations of his family, which manifested his sense of being different and special, and which challenged him to use the skills of leadership which had long been cultivated by him. The enthusiastic responses of the masses had convinced him that he had finally found God's will for him, and in Ericksonian terms had confirmed him in this social role. Not only had he come to view himself as an evangelist, but the fact that others responded to his leadership provided concrete evidence that he was correct in viewing himself in this way. His resignation and submission to the internalized maternal authority had enabled him to be exalted, and his initiative, self-will, and desire for love and intimacy were so sublimated into his religious work that he could find at least partial gratification of these previously conflict-inducing needs. If he still could not take fire into his bosom and not be burnt, at least he could kindle it in the hearts of others and warm his hands and heart vicariously through proximity to and participation in their newfound love and joy.